First, live, local. This is Fox 12 Now.
Hello everyone, I'm Greg Nibbler. This is Fox 12 Now. Thanks for joining us. We're live streaming here from the Fox 12 Oregon newsroom. You know, travel by train, particularly commuting or regular transit, happens frequently all over the world and especially even on the East Coast. But for the West Coast, not so much. There are naturally some lines that exist, but there used to be more, including one called the Pioneer train line, which technically ran from Seattle to Denver, but it traversed through Oregon as well, including central and eastern Oregon. And there are now advocates who want to bring that line back. It last ran from 1977 to 1997, so almost 30 years this has been gone. But advocates from the Association of Oregon Rail and Transit Advocates. There we go. That's the name of the organization, AORTA for short. And I spoke to Matt from that organization. They want to bring this line back. And they say it would help out tremendously, particularly for connecting both the rural and urban divide, getting people from both sides out to these different areas, but also would be important, particularly for Eastern Oregonians, to have access to medical care or different things that they can really, they can only really get from a city. So we're going to be discussing that here with this interview. That we go in depth on this topic just to go through it. So thanks for joining us. Let's jump right in here. We'll hear from Matt, thank you for joining us here today to talk about this, talk about the Pioneer train and what this would mean to bring it back. Before we get into that, would you mind telling us about the organization, you know, that you're a part of and what all it is really that you do with that?
Yeah. My name is Matt Krabacher. I am the Eastern Oregon Vice President for the Association of Oregon Rail and Transit Advocates. We like to call ourselves AORTA since that's kind of a mouthful, and AORTA is such a good acronym. So I, as the Eastern Oregon Vice President, represent AORTA's activities out in Eastern Oregon, advocating for public transit and particularly rail passenger transit. And there's lots to do out here. So I am very active, but a principal kind of thing that I pay attention to is the restoration of the Pioneer route and any efforts surrounding that and any possibilities surrounding that.
What is the current state of rail transit out in Eastern Oregon?
It's entirely freight at this point. There are lots of old abandoned stations along the old Pioneer line. We used to have the Pioneer line used to come through Eastern Oregon, but was discontinued in 1997. So there's lots of infrastructure that goes from along the Columbia River to Pendleton, then down to La Grande, through Baker City, Ontario, and on to Boise, and then on to Salt Lake City. And all of that infrastructure is like unused at this point. It's just kind of been mothballed since 1997.
And so that infrastructure is still there and available then in some capacity. I want to get into that infrastructure thing to just talk about that Pioneer line. Can you tell us,
Sure.
You know, what was the Pioneer line and really what it served?
Yeah, so the Pioneer line was one of Amtrak's major intercity long-distance routes that crossed the country. At its maximum, it ran from Seattle all the way out to Chicago. It connected, I believe, with the Zephyr somewhere in Denver or in Salt Lake City. So the Zephyr came up from California out to Chicago at some point, but it ran from Seattle all the way out to Chicago. It started, I believe it was created in 1997 and operated up until, or sorry, I said it started in 1977 and operated until 1997, at which point it was discontinued. And ever since it was discontinued, there's been strong advocacy to try and bring it back all along the line, basically between Portland and Salt Lake City, since rail service for people east of Salt Lake City continued to happen. They still had access to it because there was a few different routes that ran through those areas. It was really just the people in between Portland and Salt Lake City that lost access to the inner city rail network in America.
And when that Pioneer line was running, what did that mean for those communities that are on there, specifically, the Portland through Eastern Oregon, Boise, onto Salt Lake City, to have access to something like that?
Yeah, well, I never rode the Pioneer myself. I'm in my mid-30s and grew up in North Idaho, actually, and so only moved to Eastern Oregon after the Pioneer was discontinued. So I can't speak to the Pioneer specifically, but I did grow up along the Empire Builder line in a similar context in rural North Idaho. And for me personally, I rode that train all the time and really took for granted as a young person the value and ability I had in just going to, I rode it to North Dakota for work. I rode it to both Seattle and Portland regularly to see family and friends and attend college. I used it all the time, and I never really thought about it. It was never like that big of a deal. It was kind of a funny thing. We had to get on it in the middle of the night because there was only one a day service. But in general, it was immensely valuable to me as a young person, but I only realized that later on now in life, not having it. To the community members that I speak to in Baker City in Eastern Oregon, to them it means seeing family and friends that no longer live in Eastern Oregon, so accessing their families that have jobs and children and grandchildren out in urban areas. It means accessing specialized health care. I know people that have moved away from Eastern Oregon to Portland and other urban areas specifically because they realized they were going to have long-term medical needs that would require them to commute back and forth to Portland regularly, and they were unwilling to risk needing to do that in winters, because around here winters will close our freeways regularly, not because of specifically the snow, but because semi-trucks and crashes happen that close those lines. So it's not that snow piled up on the road, it's literally that cars crash and block the roads. And so those roads will close for sometimes 2 days. And that's a risk when you have a flight to catch, when you have medical appointments, for any of those things. The other common phrase that this is, I'm not sure where this started, but I have heard U.S. senators, rail advocates, all sorts of people quote this. This is the common phrase, is about a third of U.S. citizens don't drive at all. Children, elderly, people who choose not to, people who can't afford to own a car. A third of U.S. citizens are underserved in my area in Eastern Oregon because they don't have access to public transit.
And this is something that could help rectify some of that. Looking at, you touched on it there too, between medical care and some of these other things too that are important for people to have access to. How much of a difference do you think this would make for kind of bridging that connection a little bit between urban centers and more rural communities and more, people out in Eastern Oregon, to get access to some of these things, or just connection to some of the bigger cities?
Yeah, that's a great point. It would, I think, go a long way. I know people in Eastern Oregon feel relatively ignored, I guess, by their political representatives. And I can understand this. The explanation kind of makes sense. The majority of our population and economic activity in Oregon is on the west side. But that kind of ambivalence towards Eastern Oregon does kind of grind hard and definitely contributes to what I see as a political divide currently across America between urban and rural. And trying to figure out ways to tie those communities together by allowing people to more easily transit back and forth and experience either sides of those communities, I think would go a long way towards making people in Eastern Oregon feel heard and as though their politicians are doing anything for them, giving them access to urban services, and would go a long way towards allowing people on the west side or in the urban areas to access rural Oregon and experience it for themselves.
Yeah. So for the Pioneer line itself, What would it take to resurrect this and bring it back as something that could connect some of these different communities?
Yeah, so the current effort, like I said, since 1997, people have been advocating for its restoration, and there's been a few stalled legislative processes that have happened since then. The current effort is really based around the Biden era legislation that was in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act that came out in 2023, I want to say, that set aside something like $50 billion. I'm blanking on the specific number. I wonder if I have that pulled up actually. Not offhand. But it set aside a significant amount of money to explicitly expand intercity rail because of its climate impacts and the decarbonization on our transit system. Part of that was the creation of this long distance rail study that the Federal Rail Administration undertook. It took 2 years for them to kind of canvass all of America, all of the rail infrastructure we had, and they identified 15 different routes that they were like, these are the best 15 to go after if you're trying to increase intercity passenger rail service with a focus on reducing the carbon emissions of our transit system. The Pioneer route, or as they identify it in that report, was the Seattle to Denver route. So that is kind of what was a key moment in the kind of Pioneer rail advocacy effort, because it really gave all of us advocates something to be like, look, the federal government has money, has stated that this thing would be a good thing to pursue. And now it's just a matter of convincing our local policymakers to pursue that federal funding and start the process of restoring that service.
And what's the feedback been so far when those attempts have been made?
Yeah, part of the problem in general with the Biden era climate administrations is that there wasn't a whole lot of direction on who and how things should be taken up. In some areas more than others, but that is one of the criticisms I've seen of that legislation, and that definitely holds true for the passenger rail service in this long distance rail study. There isn't a clear statement of whom is supposed to take this up. It could be various state DOTs. It could be a new rail authority gets created. It could be the freight rail services could technically take this up. A city municipality could take this up. And the problem with leaving that so vague and giving no one a specific direction, being like, you are the person to go pursue this, here's the money, is that all of those services I just mentioned, from municipalities to states to private freight companies, is that nobody wants to be the person to pick up that bag. Everybody has their own little niche that they are working in right now. The obvious people to do it would be the state DOTs, but since this crosses multiple states, Seattle all the way to Denver is 5 different states, meaning we have 5 different DOTs that would need to coordinate themselves to figure out how to reinstate passenger rail service. Most state DOTs in America are really focused on freeways and highways, and they don't really think about rail transit as something that they do. So what we have found in Oregon is that state DOTs are resistant, and not without reason, but they're are hard to compel to get this ball moving. All of those states would have to coordinate to restore the service, and they would have to coordinate on rail infrastructure that they don't own, that the federal government doesn't own, that it's owned by private companies. So there should have been, when the IIJA was created and produced this legislation to try and incentivize passenger rail, there really needed to be a more structured authority that took up the mantle and be like, we will be the people to organize this thing. This is where our funding's going to come from. This is how we're going to do it.
And without an authority, that's a whole lot of different organizations to try to
self-organize somehow. Yeah.
Which I mean, let's just be honest, that doesn't happen too often.
Not too often.
Yeah, no matter what it is. So, just out of curiosity, is this something like that Amtrak could pick up, or would they be able to do something with it?
They could be one of those entities as well. And Amtrak is interested. Obviously, they wouldn't. They are not the they are not the default operator. They're probably the operator, but it could just be a private company could start up and be like, we're going to operate passenger rail service in this corridor and run the whole thing. That is one option as well.
Well, I mean, it sounds like this would be, a real tremendous benefit for people on both sides of this. It's definitely interesting to see where this is going to go and how that can get accomplished. For people out there, who want to know more about this or maybe can advocate for this or whatever the case may be, how can they find out more information?
Yeah, I mean, you could go to AORTA's website. aortarail.org is our website. You can go check us out there. There's bits of information. There's things there. There's Rail Passengers Association, really good, great resource. If you just Google Rail Passengers Association, RPA, they are a phenomenal national organization that does great advocacy work. If you're based in Washington, All Aboard Washington is another rail advocacy organization that we work closely with. So you could learn a lot more from any of those organizations and their respective websites. Also, if you're into wonky details, check out the Federal Rail Administration's Long Distance Rail Study, and you can read all about kind of what they proposed in terms of how to expand our rail network.
Well, Matt, thank you very much for joining us to talk about this. I mean, it's fascinating and definitely interesting, to see what this could do for so many people and just where it's at right now. I think I've learned a lot from this, and thank you so much for joining us here and sharing your time with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, so very interesting look at how that transit line could connect those different communities and why it would be important there for Eastern Oregon. So I've reached out to other organizations, so hopefully we'll have some more interviews on this going forward, just to find out a little bit from other standpoints, but we'll have that in other segments. So thanks for joining us. This is Fox 12 Now. We're live streaming here at the Fox 12 Oregon newsroom. Coming up, we're going to be actually speaking to a marine biologist. If you're watching live here, we're going to speak to a marine biologist about the whale stranded in Yachats and kind of what comes next with that situation that's happening there. So that'll be on our live stream, which is on KPTV.com or the Fox 12 Oregon apps. So I certainly recommend downloading those. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll see this interview come to an end, but you can come back and see those other interviews as well. But thanks for joining us. We will talk to you soon. I'm Greg Nibbler. This is Fox 12 Now.